time for Q&A, I will invite our panelists to unmute their videos and our attendees to submit questions if they haven't done so already. Right now, we dedicate this time to you. We will now respond to your questions and we'll try to get to as many as possible before our session ends. I want to emphasize that we are scheduling interviews with major scholars from different fields to be posted on our YouTube page, and we'll pursue a publication based on this topic. So rest assured that that your questions would be extremely helpful in shaping the next stages of this project or initiative, even if we don't get a chance to address all of them today.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually wanted to start with a question that was posed for Joshua Teplitsky, who talked about the Jewish ghetto in Prague. And Fezanor, this came from you. So your question was about if Josh also looked at Czech sources and if they would differ from German or the sources he came across in Prague, and to German sources, and if so, to what extent were they different, and kind of how were they different? This question made me think more broadly about the question of, I'm curious if thinking about epidemics as a site of often contentious practices, if any of you came across in your archival sources evidence of kind of these negotiations, or were there kind of differences in these sources, and how did you navigate or understand them? Does anyone want, do any of our panelists want to take on that question? Marine, I see you first, and then Fezanor will do you next.
Just a kind of minor response that I can make to that is that when going through the local source that I looked at, the Cihangirname, and then looking at some of the European sources and their descriptions of the numbers of dead who were occurring during the plague, we've got references to 100 people a day dying in Agra from the Cihangirname. But for example, Sir Thomas Roe, who was the ambassador from the court of James I of England to Jahangir's court, in his memoirs, he writes that 1,000 people a day are dying between the reported number of deaths which are occurring. And I think we can put that down to various exaggerations which were made on the part of the Europeans who were at the court, but also, Jahangir probably wanting to downplay the number of dead who are, occurring on a daily basis in Agra as well, so that the plague doesn't appear as severe in the Mughal sources itself.
Thank you. And Fezanor, I saw your hand too.
Thank you. Okay. So the Ottoman sources do narrate a very different, let's say not very different, but a different story from the European sources. I would say, the conceptualization of plague among the Muslims was very different compared to the European, or let's say Christian and Jewish narratives. So this led to different narratives, indeed, in different languages. I could say that, for example, in Turkish sources, you will see a more poetic conceptualization of plague, more poetic narratives around it, and let's say people would not even want to utter the word of plague even. So it was a taboo term, and this, it's been a taboo, definitely changed the narratives around it and how they would go about with the disease, let's say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any last thoughts here from our panelists? I see Carlo, yes?
Yes, referring to the comment made by Fezanor, I would like to stress that Ingrassia and other Sicilian sources talk about the difference between the Muslim and Christian concept of the plague, and given that the outbreak of Palermo that I talked about in 1576 was caused by the trade between the two sides of the Mediterranean just 5 years after the Battle of Lepanto, in the sources about the discussion of plague-related topics on the Muslim world, the Christians, or Ingrassia at least, says that it was not cured as it was seen. This is the perception of European scholars of the Muslim concept of plague, that it was seen just as a divine scourge and that it was not cured. So that is quite different in the perception that Europeans, or at least Sicilians, had of a plague in the other side of the Mediterranean. So there was this different concept that was deployed by scientists back then, just to continue on the topic.
Thank you. And we have got maybe, I see Asla Fariba's hand, and then maybe Irina, and then we can move on to another, another question. So Fariba? Oops, hold on. I've got to unmute you. Let's see. I can't, oh, there we go. There you go. You should be good now.
So I just wanted to kind of encourage us to be a bit careful about this kind of divide, cultural divide, and perceptions of the plague. I tried to highlight that in my paper. One thing that I observed from looking, I mean, and the problem with the Ottoman Empire is the absence of sources from the Muslim side. You know, they're there, and we have to discover them. We haven't discovered them yet. But one court case was really interesting. So someone brought a case to the court, the body of a son, claiming that his son had been murdered. In the court, there was a physician who was present. This is from the 16th century. They examined the body and they pointed out, you know, to the buboes in the body, you know, and then the doctor immediately said, no, your son died from the buboes, you know, not from an assault, an injury. So he is a victim of the plague, which really kind of shows early in the 16th century, and we are not even talking about the 18th and 19th centuries, you know, a very scientific, rational approach, right, to death, you know, the examination, the physical examination of the body, right, and the recording, you know, in the court documents that so-and-so died from the buboes. He or she was brought in, you know, and, you know, so what does that mean, right? So can we categorically say that in the Islamic world, the plague was seen, you know, as a punishment from God, right? And in the West, it was different. So I really want us to be, because I think, you know, these perceptions are everywhere. We cannot really say, you know, this part of the Mediterranean is thinking more rationally and the other side isn't. I just wanted to kind of add that in.
Thank you. And final thoughts from Irina?
It's just a small point. The question, of course, does not apply at all to London that has English sources, and I do not have the opportunity of comparing different languages. What I did have was the opportunity of comparing different sources. So it's very difficult when you consult medical journals, when you consult public newspaper, gazettes, articles, and professional papers delivered by architectural experts when the housing expertise becomes an issue. So sometimes the architects' lectures are extremely revealing of social attitudes. The way that architects were speaking in the 1860s and 1870s about the inhabitants of the reformed housing was extremely patronizing, and this changed already in the 1890s, changed considerably with this introduction of socialist ideals. Apart from that, I just wanted to point out the comment by Atia Kidbai in the Q&A. She makes a very interesting point that it would be interesting to parallel this case study of London with actually what happens in the colonies, from where, of course, the cholera originated in the first place.
Thank you, Irina. We do have a question that was also raised yesterday, and we intentionally kept it for today. And that has to do with your kind of perception or your predictions of future and how the current pandemics is going to impact the urban planning projects, especially when it comes to the public spaces or the affordable housing. And I know that Irina and several other speakers addressed that, but I mean, if especially Stefan or Irina, if you have any kind of predictions or any response, that would be great.
Stefan, do you want to start or?
I don't have any prediction, to be honest, so I have nothing to add.
I came across an article in The Guardian just last week that was addressing exactly this question. And of course, here you have a juxtaposition of slightly older concerns with climate change with the very fresh concerns of what COVID means. And the measures that I mentioned already, you know, the introduction of cycling lanes, or these semi-autonomous zones in which one can walk to work, and you know, you don't have to take public transport to get to the major foci of one's everyday life. But also somebody, I've been in the US a few times, but when a friend of mine said, "Oh yes, New York, the city without balconies," I was quite surprised. I never thought that actually typologically balconies are not something that are used in very much or encountered very much. And in contrast to Europe, where balcony is a very powerful presence, and that has come very clearly to light, particularly in the last few weeks and months. But there is this, the Viral Balconies project by the chair of Thomas Vermaete at TH Zurich that looks exactly at this phenomenon of how the balcony is now being used in these times. So that led me to speculate on whether the balcony might become even a normative zone, a normative addition to the dwelling, just like an internal bathroom is nowadays.
And it's quite interesting that these days we hear a lot about the efficiency and productivity of hospitals or kind of small healthcare facilities, at least in the context of the US. And I found Daniel's project fascinating, that the whole hospital design had to do with pandemics, and how hospitals were being seen as part of this urban infrastructure. So what's your, how do you see this change in future? How do you think our notion of hospital design or healthcare design, Daniel, may change as a result of this, the epidemics?
It's hard to predict, I guess, but from what I've read, a lot of architects are already considering more technological interventions, I guess, in terms of like smart elevators, or, you know, easily, or smart doors, I guess. But in terms of how architecture and public health are going to come together, I've looked, but I haven't read anything that sort of has a greater plan for how these two are gonna collaborate. These two fields are gonna collaborate. But of course, it seems like a no-brainer.
I think we all hope that the social distancing doesn't become the new norm in our societies. That's our hope. Sophia, you wanted to address this issue as well?
Only to add that I read an article by Oliver Wainwright at The Guardian, which I think comments on this very well. It's speculative about how architecture might change, but he talks about a hands-free future in buildings, so moving through spaces without interaction with the actual building, and the way that staircases might be planned to reduce person-to-person interaction, which I suppose would be a real shame.
Do you have one more comment, Fariba? You got to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I was going to kind of add that I'm just wondering whether, you know, in the 18th century Istanbul, the kind of, you know, creation of all these public and private parks had anything to do with this concept that, you know, ventilation, fresh air is good for your health. And of course, you know, the rich could afford it. You see the same thing in London, you know, the adoption of gardens, you know, public parks, private parks all over the city, You see this in Iran, and in Mughal India, and I think whether we should really kind of link the dots, and where does this movement start and originate? I know that Mohammed works on gardens, so I would like to kind of hear his feedback, on this question, because I know, he's really interested on this, whether gardens have anything to do with health.
Mohammed, do you want to respond, or do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you are raising this question, and in the last slide we were trying to say that it's really important to stay relevant. And it amazes me as a historian of Islamic architecture how much we have ignored certain issues such as health or even pandemics when it comes to the study of landscapes and gardens and even architecture in the Islamic world. And as a historian of again, Persian gardens and landscapes, that was completely out of my radar. So I'm making a big confession today.
So I want to move us on to another question, still thinking about implications. We had a question here about, we're thinking about if we envision futures in which we have to be more socially distanced as spatial practice, what are some economic implications that we might foresee? So I wanted to open that question more broadly, just to think about how you all are conceiving of potential economic effects of exactly what this question's asking, or even as we maybe start thinking about landscapes, right, that are imbued with these different meanings, kind of the healthy versus not. What implications, good, bad, or otherwise, does anyone want to amplify? Andrew, I'm wondering if you in particular have something you want to share here, since yours is one of the cases that thought about economic implications.
Well, I don't really have anything immediately intelligent to offer. I mean, I can certainly talk a little bit about the way in which the gardens and air and spaces and things like that functioned in concepts of health in 17th and 18th century Bristol, and the effect that had on the economy, because of course, as I mentioned, lots of goods were being left just outside the city in order to air. So the circulation of the air had a disinfectant property in order to get rid of miasma. But in terms of predictions for today, I'm afraid I'm not brave enough to venture an opinion on that. But thanks for the invitation.
Fair point. I know it's a challenging question as we think about what's next, right? It's hard not to want to be prescriptive here, since so much of this is still unfolding. We don't know what's coming next. Does anyone else have any thoughts about economic implications? Emily.
Yeah, mine's not going to be prescriptive, hopefully, but more just to highlight that one of the things we're seeing, especially in the US, is a shift in the economic importance of certain occupations. So the fact that 1 in 4 Americans who are working age are unemployed right now, and that those unemployed are really coming from what were considered to be like high-skilled jobs in kind of powerful positions, and that who we're relying on for the most part are people who are largely classified as wage workers. And so that's leading to questions about the economic value of particular positions and whether they're being kind of monetarily compensated in the right way. And and so that's kind of an interesting thing that's happening, that I think we've seen some historical trends with, thinking about, kind of occupational hazards in Bombay, for example, being largely confined to wage workers as well. It's a trend that I'm not really sure what's going to happen with it. So much as it's just interesting that that's kind of an echo.
Thank you, Emily. We have a question from Marcus about sustainable architecture and the fact that how do you think the pandemics is going to make an impact on this movement that we already had in our building design, architectural design, and urban planning towards designing cities that are more sustainable? I know that Nicole kind of addressed these environmental issues that are quite ignored in the discussion of pandemics, because we are just so focused on our urban societies that we completely neglect the environment and what's going to happen to the environment in the post-COVID age. So I want to ask Nicole if she has any observations on this, and after that maybe Suzanne if she has any observations on Japan.
I would say, just reiterating the kind of concluding points that I made, that I would, rather than thinking of sustainable architecture in terms of, you know, a sustainable building, I think we first need to think on this global scale of land use, because the kind of, you know, rapid consumption of land is a core issue that really ties, kind of is this entanglement of issues that we need to address. And then beyond that, if we think of kind of green architecture, sustainable architecture, beyond all of the flashy marketing that goes with it, I think what it really comes down to is just good living conditions for people. And I think, you know, we've seen architects already kind of responding to all these calls, as Irina was mentioning, for balconies, etc., and kind of pushing back on a lot of the kind of the forces from the market that have pushed towards micro apartments, spaces with really poor conditions of living. And I think if we just focus on offering people good living spaces with air, with sunlight, that's going to be a major step forward already. And to me, that's kind of the basis of sustainable architecture.
And you're absolutely correct that probably in architecture we are over obsessed with building design, right? That we completely ignore land as the basis of any intervention. Suzanne, do you have any observations on this issue of environment and sustainability? Go ahead, please. Suzanne, we can't hear you.
Yeah, thinking about this question and also the previous one about the economic implications of epidemic, you know, the Tokyo case, there was a recognition very early on in the 1870s that there were problems with water supply and sanitation. And there actually, government did studies to figure out how much it would cost to improve the situation. And they didn't go that route. They made an economic decision that quarantine was a more cost-efficient way of dealing with the epidemic, because the government had other priorities in this period, including industrialization and building a military. And so I think, you know, in the contemporary debates about the current pandemic and opening the country and what it means for human life, there's a similar sort of equation going on. And I think that's disturbing to think about, that the notion it's cheaper to forcibly move people into a quarantine hospital than to deal with the long-term problem of a contaminated water supply. And I think as we think about urban design and the kinds of decisions that are being made by elected public officials, this is something to think about. You know, how do we evaluate the value of human life in the midst of a pandemic when there are other economic concerns at play?
Thank you. My next question is going to be about colonies and the colonizers and how this complexifies interventions. So this is an unformed question on my behalf. It was much better formed by those who wrote in with questions about colonies. But I'm curious if any of our panelists want to talk about colonies. Emily, I think I remember you mentioning this yesterday, but how can we conceive of relationships between kind of the colonizers, colonies, and also these interventions, and were they the same, different, tinged with anything new? Do you want to start us off, Emily?
Sure. This actually gets right at the heart of my dissertation project, which kind of looks at the ways that infrastructures have been moved, like especially sanitation and infrastructures have been moved into different landscapes and colonial urban spaces. And often they're kind of modeled wholesale on British sanitation patterns. So for example, in Bombay, there were plans to kind of build sewers that were based around Joseph Bazalgette's sewers almost completely. But of course, then there was the question of monsoon patterns and drainage, all of which were very different in Mumbai than they were in London. And also that kind of creates a space for a different species of rat to come in and live in sewers, which is the Norway rat, which is not actually indigenous to the area, but is kind of moved in via shipping. Yeah, and so you see this kind of, in that kind of short narrative, you can kind of see the ways in which like non-locally adapted interventions can lead to unexpected and difficult consequences. And so there are these kinds of relationships between power, like kind of colonial powers and colonized spaces where in the kind of clashing of infrastructure and ecology, you get positions for the emergence of epidemics, right? Yeah, and that's something that has a legacy even today in the way that the cities are constructed and in the way that epidemics emerge. So.
Thank you. And to switch gears just slightly, Desiree, I know that that you talked about a different kind of a different context, but I'm seeing echoes of this question in how your case study of the U.S. treatment of prisoners of war. So I'm wondering if you had any comments here.
Sure, I guess we can think of sort of U.S. empire during World War II and the way former territories, Hawaii, Alaska, but also today we have Puerto Rico and other places in the Pacific and Caribbean that kind of remain in these sort of limbo legal statuses. For me, and thinking about prisoners of war, it's really the ocean, which has this sort of no man's kind of land almost. And I was really struck by the Navy ship that arrived in New York and kind of the images. And I remember thinking back to archival footage of these sort of Navy ships roaming or roving the Pacific waters. But we can also think of that in terms of cruise ships that sort of inhabit this kind of non-place. And these are often oceanic jurisdictions that seem to take on their own kind of legal status. So not just colonies, but landscape that kind of moves off of like contiguous land masses onto islands, oceans, and shores that seem to, in wartime and emergency situations, in the case of pandemics and epidemics, take on these new kind of roles as areas of experimentation, areas of occupation that just get enhanced. And I was actually in Hawaii when COVID-19 broke out, and it was surprising to see how kind of a former territory that's now a state has been able to sort of monitor cases, but isn't able to control kind of domestic travelers who are coming in from the US mainland, who still see Hawaii as a tropical destination that's far away and that's immune. So also islands and travel and touristic kind of destinations and the immunity from disease where people are kind of escaping to it. So all these kind of factors, I think for me really solidified in thinking about this colonizer colony where these places are still viewed as inhabitable places in spite of, restrictions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Desiree. I think that the human beings have found every single tool to destroy the earth, talking about the cruise ships, right? So we are clever in that sense. One of the questions that are raised by our attendees here, Atia, has been talking about the connections between England and the British colonies and the hygiene policies having to do with the mainland. And we see the same thing in, for example, Mozambique, where the Portuguese are kind of implementing the same policies. But as a result of these pandemics, in many of these contexts, we all see that the segregation is gonna get worse, right? So the pandemics makes cities and urban spaces more segregated. So I want to ask Anne-Marie and Kathleen if in their studies found anything that they had to do with this notion of segregation and that the role that the pandemics, the epidemics played in their cases.
In the case of York, it's, in a sense, it's the other way around, that the susceptibility to endemic disease or epidemic disease is concentrated in those low-lying areas which are close to rivers and are inhabited by poor people. But you know, the architectural historians among us will know that Vitruvius in the 1st century is advising people to site their high-quality building up high. So the people who are protected are the people in the better quality housing, and that kind of runs through from antiquity all the way through. It's interesting, these patterns. I mean, we're talking about islands, and the original locus classicus of the hospital was on an island in the middle of the Tiber in Rome. So in some respects, people's behavior is very deeply, it's culturally ingrained. You know, people are just doing what they're doing. So in my observation, it's not, because I haven't been looking at the development of housing subsequently, it's that where the patterns of unappealing land are, that's where you find poor people dwelling, and that's where you know, there's the concentration of people who are susceptible is.
Katalin?
Yeah, thank you. In the cases which I looked at, it's not so much the spatial segregation, but rather the differentiation by wealth, which is considered in the sources. So, for instance, the pamphlet which I looked at by a certain Salzman prescribes different sort of remedy to different parts of the population. So if you cannot afford this kind of medicine, if you cannot afford to fumigate with some very exotic incenses, then you can still buy another type, a cheaper one, something which is generally available. So I was quite surprised to see how much of an awareness there was to the different carrying capacity of the population and offering different sorts of possibility of defense. But also there was a very self-conscious attitude that our community was saved, but all the others who didn't afford or could not afford to invite an educated physician, or couldn't afford to implement those measures which meant the lockdown, they were just ravished by the plague and they were not saved, and they can just thank it to their own unpreparedness that they could not be saved. So in a way, one can see certain considerate attitudes, but also quite selfish concentration of one's own ability. So this lockdown can also cause very much selfishness, egoism, which is an undesirable consequence, of course.
And I think a very interesting part of your presentation was that you were talking about segregation, not in local context, but in macro context. I mean, the empire, where you showed us this list of cities that kept growing and growing in a way, kind of, it was like a blacklist, right? And we see the same thing here, that first you stop moving, I mean, bringing people from Wuhan, and then there's this list that is being kind of developed and evolves over time. Caitlin?
I see Irina's hand. Irina?
Just quickly, but the issue of segregation, of course, is very interesting in urban situations where you have very abrupt changes in the fabric and the demographics of one area and another. In the case of the slums in 19th century London, I became fascinated by them simply because I could not quite picture them, because they were completely razed down and they disappeared as a form. But they were not segregated. They were right in the center of town. They were often hidden behind semi-respectable facades or very, very close proximity to some of the rich parts of town. So for example, St. Giles Rookery was right in the center and close to Regent Street. But what's interesting about the epidemic, the consequences of epidemics, was exactly that the segregation was somehow rendered insignificant. And this is what caused the political action ultimately. The fact that the disease was just around the corner and it was coming to get you no matter how much money you had. And then you had enough capital, financial and social, to actually lobby the powers that be and change the course of action. So, you know, it's very interesting that it worked both ways. The segregation formed these foci of infection, but at the same time, it was abolished by, or it was attempted to be abolished by centralized measures.
So we'll close it out with Andrew. Andrew, what thoughts do you want to share?
Yeah, well, I just, I mean, I'm really interested in the comments of the previous three, but just to refer to what Irina was saying, that the context, the sort of political, historical context in which these epidemics take place is very important as well with regards to the questions of whether or not the disease is a great leveler. And I think the example of Bristol is instructive here, because of the two outbreaks that took place during the Civil War, one, which was of typhus and happened in 1643, affected everybody equally. Like, there was not much difference in who was affected in what parish. The whole city was affected. But 2 years later, after the capture of the city by the parliamentarians, there was another outbreak of bubonic plague, which was also severe, but which tended to affect the poorer parishes more than the wealthier. And another interesting aspect as to relating the zoning, the physical zoning of a city with the economic communities as well, is that over time, you often got wealthier individuals who in Bristol, as I said, occupied that sort of middle third of the city, moving into poorer areas because it was higher up, because they had the ability to escape the stink, which was really bad in Bristol during the summer. They moved up to St Michael's Hill, and it became, by the late 18th century, quite a well-to-do neighbourhood. So you actually had this sort of repurposing of areas as well.
Thank you. So I realize that we have gone well beyond our advertised endpoint, but I'm really thrilled that we're able to answer so many questions. I want to thank our participants for sending us really wonderful questions. I wanted to just offer a brief moment to see if any of our panelists wanted to share any reflections or insights that have come up for them in participating here. Carlo, I see your hand, so we'll take maybe Carlo and maybe one or two more after this. Thank you.
Since we talk about prisoners of war and current times and political context, I want to notice that in the 16th century, we were in the middle of a war, and it was in my PhD research, I'm studying the redemption of Christian slaves, and they were usually quarantined in ships for 40 days before going back to Sicily. One thing that I want to notice that is different from today and that we can learn from that era is that even today in Sicily, when migrants from Africa are coming to the coast of Sicily, it was difficult for Lampedusa and Italian authorities to organize safe ships for quarantine. Well, it was really easy, and it was normality in the 16th century. So this is something that really impressed me, because it was the normality from the period I was studying back then, but today it was like some hard thing to do. And so this is something that I think that was the aim of this seminar, to learn from the past and from some solution of the past. Just only this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have any last thoughts or observations, Fariba?
Yeah, coming from California, where we have all kinds of natural disasters, our governor is telling us that we have to next worry about fires, earthquakes, every day, pandemics, of course, less often. I was, wondering, as urban historians, whether we can take a bit of holistic approach, especially to some cities, like Istanbul, just like, Los Angeles, went through all these problems, and maybe point in the direction of the impact of climate change. I think we have been avoiding that. And of course, it's in the background, politicians avoid it right now. And I think we need to, as responsible scholars, maybe point in that direction a bit.
Thank you. And Anne-Marie, I see your hand.
Yeah, I started my presentation with a reflection that in the UK, there was a pandemic simulation in 2016, and the consequences or the results of that were ignored. The government was distracted with Brexit, and I think rich countries, rich governments have hubristically assumed that epidemics were not a thing for us. We've got that. We have science, we have medicine, we've got hospitals, we've had antibiotics since the middle of the 20th century. We've got that down. And this has come as a massive wake-up call because, there's Zika virus or there's Ebola, but it's somewhere else. And all of a sudden, the rich Western societies have realized that we need to address this as well. My anxiety, however, and those of you who are in the UK or who watch politics in the UK will be aware that events are moving really rapidly, and any optimism I may have had a few weeks ago is beginning to ebb away about the future, I have to say.
So with that, this is my attempt to rather inelegantly end us. I want to thank everyone for their observations, for their thoughts, for their case studies, for their fantastic questions. This has truly been a phenomenal community effort. It's been great to work across space and time. So I want to thank our panelists, also our participants. Mohammed, are there any thoughts that you want to share before we end?
I wanted to echo your comments. We are really grateful to our panelists because at least you and I know how much they worked in the last 7 weeks. It was just day and night working on their lectures and revising them. And so we are really grateful to them and all people who joined us and probably the audience, the YouTube audience. It's a new experience for all of us. And I want to emphasize that this is the beginning of an initiative. So we will continue our efforts and just stay tuned. Yeah.
Great. So with that, let's say thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it. Take good care, stay safe, stay healthy.